I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, the Outsourcing Accelerator, OI's Outsourcing RFP Builder Software Demo and Discussion. My name is Arlene Itori, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute, and it is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with Sylvan Advisory. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. We encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speaker. To do this, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click on the Submit button. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar. The webinar recording and a copy of the presentation will also be available at outsourcing.com. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our moderator, Dan Goodstein, Managing Director at the Outsourcing Institute, for the formal introduction of today's speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Arlene. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Dan Goodstein here. Thank you for joining us today for the Outsourcing Accelerator RFP Builder Demo. This is a pretty exciting tool and piece of software that we put some time and effort into here at the Outsourcing Institute. Many of you know us for our content and community events and online type of resources and even some matchmaking. But many of you don't know that we are newly in the software business. And have built an RFP builder tool with our friends at Sylvan 6. So if speed, cost, quality, and resources are key factors to you, I think you'll find this very valuable. So thrilled to have Paul Pinto here today from Sylvan 6 to show this to you. Paul is kind of lead on this project and is managing partner at Sylvan 6, where he's responsible for advisory services. Paul's been in the business for 25 plus years and typically advises clients regarding the benefits of outsourcing and how to implement outsourcing both on the buy and sell side. Has done this for a large list of Fortune 2000 companies. So no one better to kind of walk you through this than Paul Pinto. Real quick background in the Outsourcing Institute. For those of you who don't know us, we are the largest professional association of outsourcing executives globally with 70,000 members. And for many years, we've been sort of a go-to source for trends, best practices, and case studies in the space. Also training available through our OI University program, and recruiting opportunities and services through our sister company, CMS. If you haven't seen the announcement yet, please look for emails regarding our Fall Roadshow series. We will be in New York on December 8th, as well as Texas, Houston, Texas, also December 8th. Just prior to that, we'll be in Columbus, Ohio on November 9th. So we're going to be talking again about innovation throughout the outsourcing process. So don't miss that if you are in those cities or will be in those cities on those dates. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Paul Pinto, who will give us a walkthrough on this demo.
Great, thank you, Dan. As Dan said, I am Paul Pinto. Been in the business around 25 years, working for advisory services firms. And Arlene, could you go to the next slide, please? I'll give you a little background on this. We, Sylvan Advisory, partnered with the Outsourcing Institute back in 2009. And some visionaries at the Outsourcing Institute saw a distinct need in the market for the ability to build good RFPs. What we then did was we assembled a committee of buyers and sellers. So we included folks from IBM and Citigroup and Home Depot and AIG. I think there was 12 buyers, 12 participants in total on the advisory committee. And we took them through the process of defining the requirements for what makes a good RFP. So we looked at it from both the buy side and the sell side, because we realized there was a lot of RFPs that vendors would just simply throw in the garbage. Next slide, please. So if you take a look at today, how many transactions require an RFP, it's estimated that over $3 billion will be purchased through RFPs. From the seller's perspective, it's estimated that over 50,000 sellers are in the market in the U.S. and Europe today, a large number of which pursue and respond to RFPs. So if you acknowledge the RFP as kind of being at the center of starting a transaction, and what this software is all about is getting a good transaction completed quickly to both the buyer and the seller's benefit. Next slide, please. So let's take a quick look at if you were to build an RFP yourself. And look at the middle column there that says original work. So if I were to sit down and build an RFP from scratch, meaning I didn't have the legacy of having built one just like it before, I had to come up with all the wording myself, build the RFP, and then I had to send it out and collect all the responses and then evaluate all those, typically with spreadsheets, and then negotiate a deal and build the contracts. For an average size RFP, I'd spend 500 or so personal hours, and it would take me 6 months to do. And I realize there's no such thing as an average RFP. Right? They range in size from the very small to some we've worked on. The vendor selection process has taken 1.5 years for very large deals. But acknowledge an average size one. Now, assuming that I'm somebody who's built RFPs before and I have access to a number of templated documents that I've used in the past, be they spreadsheets or word processing documents, I can beg, borrow, and steal pieces from other RFPs. I could get it done in about 167 hours in 12 weeks. So I've got that ability. But now if I'm someone either new to an area, new to BPO, maybe I'm coming from ITO and new to BPO, and there's certain terms that I'm not familiar with, I could certainly use a tool to help me. Or if I simply need to produce a large number of RFPs quickly, I can then use a tool like the Outsourcing Accelerator, and you'll see how in very short order we can produce very high quality RFPs. Next slide, please. So the Accelerator is really focused on not just producing RFPs, but it also allows the user to produce an RFI. So we also found by polling our study group that too many times buyers have gone to RFP without being ready to solicit a proposal, and that they were really performing an RFI. And in some cases, they were really performing something in between, kind of a collaborative RFI, RFP. So we actually built the tool with a set of questions in it that asks the buyer and assesses their level of maturity to put out an RFP. So the tool doesn't just provide you with an RFP template. It provides you with logic as to what should be stuffed into the RFP template. Next slide, please. If you look at the entire life cycle of everything that goes on within outsourcing, this software product is really just focused on the area highlighted in blue. So it's focused on gathering the requirements, putting out an RFI, RFP, getting responses back from the vendor electronically, evaluating those responses, then negotiating with the selected provider, and producing a contractual agreement. So everything we're going to show you today in this tool, and we are going to do a live demo, by the way, everything we show you in this tool is pre-sale. It's got nothing to do with after the sale is complete. It's not managing the transition. It's not trying to be a governance tool by any stretch. It's not a business case development tool. It assumes you've got understand your requirements and you need a facility to build a world-class RFP and then collaboratively get that out to the vendors and get responses back, evaluate it, negotiate it, and produce contracts. So I wanted to put that in a box so it's evident to everybody. Next slide, please. So the lead screen of the Outsourcing Accelerator, which again we're going to do it as a live demo, which has its risk, but we will share all of that with you. Next slide, please. Next slide. So let's go into the business problem. And I'm going through these quickly because I want to spend the majority of time actually surfing around in the tool. So the current RFP process is done in kind of a linear fashion. It tends to take a long time. Usually starts with an RFI, down select set of vendors, to an RFP, further due diligence, and then evaluation occurs, typically in spreadsheets outside of the process. And it takes a long time. It's heavily paper-laden, and a high level of administration. That's today's process, and I won't harp on it too much. Anybody who's been involved either preparing an RFP or responding to one is very familiar with the standard RFP process. Next slide, please. The reason people like the RFI-RFP process is typically there's templates that exist within organizations. It's very proven. It's worked for a number of years. High degree of comfort with it. And it does promote competition between vendors, which is probably the most salient benefit. Next slide, please. So why upgrade? We've got a process that works. Well, what if you could do the same thing faster than you could before, with a higher degree of quality, with less internal cost, involve more users in your organization electronically, and waste less paper? That's the impetus behind the Outsourcing Accelerator. Next slide. So if we take a look at a modified process, to where we can go straight to an RFP, facilitate a level of mutual or bilateral due diligence, evaluate the vendors and negotiate the contract terms, but pull that up forward a bit, and do this all in an electronic forum without really the need to produce one piece of paper. That's what the Outsourcing Accelerator is doing for us. Now, I always get the question about, well, but it's not a replacement for due diligence. That's correct. It's not a replacement for due diligence. You still have to meet the vendor face-to-face. You still have to understand their capabilities and assess them. They still have to come in and assess the scope of the engagement and confirm SLAs. So the accelerator is not to be viewed as a substitute for due diligence. It simply accelerates all of the processes. Next slide, please. So, let's talk about RFP 2.0, we'll call it. Still leverages the proven process, has the ability to perform what we like to call matchmaking services, to where since the requirements are documented in a tool and selected from a cafeteria-style menu, we now have the ability to match with a preferred vendor. Now that capability is not available in the tool today. That is an extra service that one could purchase. It is fully electronic, and you'll see it's an entirely collaborative environment between the buyer and the seller that simply produces results faster. Next slide, please. So let's go into the Outsourcing Accelerator. Just as a briefing, and we're going to go through some of this fast for the sake of time. I'm going to show you the tool, and it is role-based, and it is SaaS-based. So we're going to do a live demo on the web in the tool itself. We're going to go in as a buyer and establish an RFP. And then we're going to see the seller's perspective. So once an RFP is submitted, you select the sellers from a list. They receive it, and they respond electronically. Once they submit their responses, you go in from the buy side as an evaluator, and you evaluate those responses, and you weight and rate them. And that gives you a quantitative analysis. You still have to perform a qualitative analysis of the vendor responses and the vendor and their cultural fit, and a variety of other things. Then once you select the vendor you want to move forward with, you can essentially hit a button and have it produce the first draft of the contractual agreements. So this isn't to displace the need for a legal staff. It's simply to get you a first draft of all the required contracts associated with an outsourcing agreement. And then you could go into the legal discussions about what the preferred T's and C's are. So that's the scope of the accelerator. And Arlene, if you could go ahead and turn control over to me.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. And hopefully you're able to see my screen. Yeah,
I can see your screen, Paul.
Well, thank you. Okay, so let's go into the accelerator. And I'm going to go in as a buyer. So I'm a new buyer, and I have a number of RFPs here. And let me go into a fresh RFP. And what you're seeing is across the top are all the components of a standard RFP. So under background, we have the executive summary and company background information, scope. Right now, the RFP builder has content in it to support IT outsourcing, application development, maintenance, and testing outsourcing, and generic business process outsourcing. So think about the Outsourcing Accelerator as having, it's got over 1,000 requirements embedded in it, components of an RFP, that you can simply click on and choose to include in your RFP or exclude from your RFP. Now the tool has built-in intelligence in it. It's going to ask you a series of questions. Depending how you answer those questions, it's going to subset those 1,000 requirements for you. It'll show you all of them, but it'll make a recommendation as to the ones you should include in your RFP. It's got an approach section which talks about all the components of project management, all the components of a transition, which most people miss, and the components of service delivery. It also goes through and provides a list of SLAs, which everybody seems to miss and a lot of people have a problem with. ITO SLAs, ADMO SLAs, and BPO SLAs. It goes on and talks about the staffing, how you're going to staff the transition in steady state, and how you want to work pricing, time and materials, fixed fee, transaction based, and then references, standard form for references. So let me take you through a few screens. You'll also notice there's a next button to the right and a back button to the left. So if I just don't understand the RFP process, I could keep nexting my way through this, and it'll take me through the natural flow of building an RFP. So you see here, I can enter in my company name and URL, description. Everywhere along the way I can attach a document if I see fit. I can enter my name and title, my address. If different, I can go in and put in any secondary contact information, specifics about the RFP itself. And what I'd like to do, as opposed to going through this empty one, I do want to, let me jump around and show you just a couple components of, scope, just to give you a flavor for what's in here. Right, so here's a piece of scope around the IT outsourcing environment. Here's project management execution. So now I'm jumping around, and you'll see it's got all of the requirements that I'm going to ask of a vendor. At any place I can attach an attachment, or I can add a new line item. If my requirement's not here, I can simply add a new one. I can turn line items off. I can also just simply go in and type over them and add new line items. So by going through this, I can scan through as few as 300, as many as 1,000 requirements, and confirm or deny that they should be part of my RFP. Now, what I'm going to do is go back and show you one that we've already gone through and prepared. So this one is a testing RFP, and you'll see it's completely populated with all the information I was alluding to. I can go through it. Now I'm just nexting my way through. It asks me about the due diligence period, and I've got an attachment here. Let's pull that up. So it talks about the need for a transmittal letter. Okay, if I go to the level of interaction the vendors will have, I've chosen 2, and I've placed an attachment here, who the primary contact is. So the tool gives you choices along the way. You pick the ones you want. If your choice is not there, you can add it. And anywhere along the way, you can add an attachment. So after I get through that base information, here's my non-disclosure agreement, the submission date, who owns the response, Are the vendor's costs covered? What's the term of validity? All the base questions. And all I'm doing is clicking a button. I will handle the selection process. Then the tool goes in and asks me a series of questions. Depending how I respond to these questions, the tool makes a recommendation if I'm ready for an RFP or not. So all the tool's doing in these questions is assessing what I know and the level of maturity of my organization. So at the end of these, and I want to say it's 44 questions, you see it up at the top there, tells you how many questions I've answered of the 44. The tool then recommends that I go with an RFP, and it explains the benefit of an RFP over an RFI. And now it subsets these 1,000+ requirements down to what it thinks I should include. So now if I start looking through this, and what it's done is checked off certain things for inclusion in the RFP. So hopefully you get the idea. The tool's got 1,000+ requirements. It takes a crack at determining which ones make most sense. I can modify it, add to it, change it as I see fit. That's building the RFP. If I know what I'm doing, I could build a world-class RFP in about 3 hours by going through the tool. So Dan, have we received any questions thus far?
Actually, good timing, Paul, we have. So one question that just came in is related to the questions on ITO and ADMO. Are they based on the ITIL framework?
They are, as a matter of fact.
Second question here is how do you assess a cultural fit? Is there something here that you could show us?
There is not. Right? So that's the exact point I had talked to earlier. This isn't a substitute for due diligence. This is a quantitative analysis. You still have to do bilateral due diligence. This will help you with the math and the physics. The chemistry is on you.
Right, makes sense.
So I'm now logging in. Let's assume I prepared my RFP using the tool. I've identified the vendors I want to send it to. I've invited them to join this forum and bid. They see the same screens I just showed you. I'm not going to show you the vendor's view, but I'm going to show you an evaluator's view. So assume the vendor has responded to the RFP in the tool. They've submitted it. I can now go in as an evaluator, and I could review the RFP that was submitted. The first thing I have to do as the lead evaluator is I have to apply weights and rates, the weighting to all of the sections. Based on a series of algorithms, the tool takes the first shot at applying weights. If I don't like those weights, I can change them. But that can only be done by the lead evaluator. I could have 1,000 evaluators evaluating this vendor's response, but only the lead evaluator gets to change the weights. So once I set the weights, I can then go in and view this vendor's response. So here's vendor company A, and here's their response. So let's go in and see what they answered for the executive summary questions. So you'll see 4.1.1.1, I asked them to provide a high-level description of their company. There's their response. We're a global provider of IT. This is the attachment I placed. Here's the attachment they included. So I can see whatever they want to attach in whatever form they attach it. Very good. And then I go in and I rate that response. And I rate it as either a very low to very high, or I can call it a deal breaker, meaning this is just untenable, or it's a real differentiator. I can also add a comment at any time associated with my rating. So as I go through, anywhere where I see a green star, I've already rated that response. So I could rate a couple responses and then come back. I could just keep nexting my way through and continue rating these responses. I could divide the sections up amongst a variety of evaluators and ask different evaluators to rate each section where they have specific domain knowledge. So I could just next through and rate all 174 of these requirements. But let me jump to the end. Let's say I go through this and I rate all of that. I then get a spreadsheet at the end that says here's the requirements and here's all the ratings and here's all the weightings. I also see any notes, the extreme right there, that were added. And then you can export this to an Excel spreadsheet as well. So you could do all the slicing and dicing you would want. So now what we've done is we've built an RFP. We've invited vendors to bid all electronically. They've responded. We've gone in and engaged a number of evaluators to evaluate their responses on the same scale. So we've gotten rid of the use of a spreadsheet. They've gone in and performed a level of evaluation, again, all in this tool. And I could go ahead and let me export this to Excel. All right, so there's my evaluation results. I can see it across evaluators. I could see it across vendors. I could see it for one question at a time. Right, I can see it a number of different ways to slice and dice the data. As the lead evaluator, I can now go back in and I could change the weighting if I so desired to do what-if analysis. You know, if the weighting was different, would the final score be different? So right now this vendor's score is 312.83. Right? Would the score be different if I changed the weighting between vendors? So as the lead evaluator, I can perform what-if analysis now. Dan, any questions?
Well, yeah, so the question I knew we'd get, Paul, is around other tools that an organization might already be invested in, like Ariba or the like. So how do you, I don't think we integrate with that. You want to talk about how that compares?
Yeah. So, and we get that question a lot, by the way. So acknowledge Ariba, mTaurus. There's a few others out there that do similar kind of things. What they lack is the content richness of this environment. So acknowledge this as kind of a category killer associated with outsourcing. Whereas Ariba, mTaurus, one, they don't have the flexibility that this tool has. Yeah, you could stuff all of this information in, but you'd have to accumulate all of it first. And then potentially it could function somewhat the same way, but you'd make a pretty big investment in stuffing it, where this available SaaS basis is literally, hundreds, perhaps thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands of dollars. So a very different target market. This tool is really targeted for kind of the mid-tier company who perhaps doesn't have the wherewithal to produce world-class RFPs, but does need to produce them, either once in a while or produce them on an ongoing basis. Whereas the larger tools, the mTaurus and the Ariba, tend to be for larger organizations that are buying a lot of products and or services. Great. Any other questions, Dan?
No, that's good. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. So now let's go in. Let's say I put out the RFP. I've got the responses back. I've engaged a number of evaluators. They've evaluated it. We've performed due diligence and cultural fit. We've selected the vendor we think is the go-forward vendor. And now what I'd like to do is start the negotiation process. So what we do now is we take all of the components of the vendor's response. We answer 11 questions. Do we want them to provide transition services? Right, will process improvements be included? We select which vendor is the one that we want to choose, and everything gets sucked from this, from the vendor's response and the RFP, into a set of templated contracts. So if you look at the templated contracts, and these were developed as best-of-breed bilateral agreements. So for the master service agreement, we've got all the components, and I'll take you through those. A description of the services, what kind of protections are afforded in the agreement, the relationships of the parties, and here I can choose to include or exclude any of these sections. We also have a full list of schedules. So you'll see there defined terms, SOW, a list of SLAs, governance, fee and payment schedules, security and privacy schedules, audits, and so on. And let's just go into one of those. So under security and privacy, which is top of mind for everybody, you see all the components of a security and privacy terms and conditions, and I can go into even further under risk management and under risk assessment. Right, so the first shot at a very rigorous contract with all its exhibits. So let's crawl into a couple places. Let's go into the main services piece. See, it's got the contract wording. If I want, I can change this wording right here. I can add whatever I want to it. I can choose to exclude it from my final document. I can also add an entire new section if I so desire. Right, so again, this isn't intended to be a contract management mechanism. This is intended to get you the first draft at a best-in-class set of contractual agreements. So I can go through, again, I can next my way through each piece of this contractual agreement. I can read all the terms, disagree or agree with them, add new terms as I see fit. I can go through all of the exhibits. Let's take a look at SLAs. Right. Anywhere there's a yellow highlighted field, that's a variable that's going to be populated from the selected vendor's response. So I've got the basis for building all the SLAs in here. The insurance requirements, another very typical exhibit or schedule to include. We've also got a number of exhibits on steady state fees, transition fees, a T&M rate card template, retained tasks, personnel list. Okay. After I go through all of this, and after I do it for the first time, I tailor it for my organization. I may take it just the way it is, because these are fair, best-in-class bilateral contracts. Once I go through that, I can then go ahead and finalize it, but I can produce the actual MSA. So here is a first cut at a master services agreement. You see it's 37 pages. Right? It's gone ahead and populated those highlighted fields. It's pulled those from the RFP and or the vendor response wherever appropriate. And I have a very rigorous first cut master services agreement. So for an organization that's been doing a lot of outsourcing, you already have a master service agreement template. That template can be built in here. So it can come up with your good first pass. If you don't have an existing MSA, you can use this one that's provided with the tool, which again is a vetted bilateral MSA. Now, we're obviously not taking any responsibility for the legality of it, because that's not the business the software is in. But the software is attempting to get you a first cut set of agreements. Let's go in and take a look at the schedules. So we'll go ahead and export the schedules to Microsoft Word. And you see a first cut at the schedules. Again, this is 74 pages, which may be overkill. That's fine. It's much easier to delete than it is to add. So here's all the defined terms within a contract, which is a very typical schedule. The statement of work. Right, the SLA agreements. Governance, which is an area most people miss. So if you think about, and again, I want you to give some thought to how quickly we are able to accelerate the outsourcing process by producing these starter documents. Let me go through the last one is the exhibits. So if we open up the exhibits, and again, a lot of these exhibits are specific to what was included in the vendor's response. So where a vendor cited an SLA or agreed with an SLA that was asserted, that SLA comes over. So you've got a first shot at what the vendor committed to in the sales cycle. So we're starting to connect the RFP requirements, the vendor's response, and the contractual agreements. And again, you got to view these as a first pass. The tool isn't meant to be a configuration manager for the contracts. It is intended to give you a first cut. So here's transition SLAs as provided by the vendor in their response. Right, not bad for a first pass. Now during negotiations, these will change. That's fine. You go ahead and change them in the Word document. You wouldn't go back into the tool to change those. All right, so hopefully you get an idea of why it's called the Outsourcing Accelerator and some of the benefits of it. Dan, any other new questions?
No, I think you answered it, Paul. I had a question here about how the tool kind of works in the negotiation process. So if you get it down to 2 vendors, let's say instead of 1, how does the tool help and assist there?
Yeah, so the tool is just going to give you a quantitative analysis based on the ratings, and you could go ahead and produce 2 contracts and negotiate them both in parallel. Please remember, the tool is not a substitute for us performing a cultural fit analysis, for us checking the references on the vendor. Right? All the tool is doing, it's organizing the RFP process and the collection of the responses, the evaluation, and the generation of a first pass contract. The tool doesn't take the place of any of those soft kind of activities, right? The people-to-people, the cultural fit, the assessment of are they really right for me in my gut. The tool doesn't do that. No tool could do that. Right? So all it can do is what a tool can do. It can accelerate all of those components. And if you notice, I can go through the entire RFP process without generating one piece of paper. Right? I could produce a paper RFP by exporting it. I could produce all the evaluation results in Excel by exporting it. I can produce all the contracts in Word, but the reality is I don't have to leave the environment. The vendors can ask questions across the environment. There was an inquiry button. You also see there's an Ask an Expert button in the upper right-hand corner. It provides context-sensitive help. So if I don't understand a certain component of the RFP or an SLA, I can type my question and it goes back to an authority at the Outsourcing Institute who then responds to me about what I should be thinking about. So this is really very well positioned for someone who's either new to the RFP process or maybe new to the type of RFP, BPO, RFP, or someone who needs to get out a bunch of RFPs quickly. That's really the target market. Great. Any other questions?
Paul, what does the vendor side look like? So a vendor's plugging into this, what do they see?
So let me go ahead, since I was able to run through that pretty quickly, I'll show you the vendor side. So I'll log in as a vendor. And it essentially looks the same. So this vendor would have been invited to bid. They would have been given the access credentials. Oh, I didn't like that password. Hold on. For whatever reason, just make sure I have the right login. There we go. So if I'm a vendor, this is what I see. I get in, I can assign sub-sellers to this. I see all the responses provided by the buyer. I can view their attachments. Right, so here's a fact sheet on the company. I can just next my way through it. right? I can see when the due date is. Now remember I showed you those categories you check off. Notice only the ones that were checked are displayed to the vendor. So not all the choices, just the ones that were checked, and any attachments. If I go through to the executive summary piece, and now I'm starting to answer questions, right, here's my response. I entered all of this, and I put up an attachment. If I wanted to, I can now ask a question. I could submit an inquiry to the buyer. So they'll get all the vendor inquiries electronically, and they can choose to respond back to the one vendor or to all vendors. So the interface is the same. They can view what was attached, they can add a new attachment, and they can ask questions. And they simply next their way through it as well. They only see the requirements that were selected, and they complete the boxes. So it's also relatively easy from a vendor side. They could respond to an RFP pretty quickly by simply saying, you know, here's my quick answer and here's an attachment, a piece of a PowerPoint, a Word document, a white paper, a video clip. Right? They can attach whatever they want. Anything that they want evaluated as part of the scenario. Great. Any other questions?
I think you're good.
Dan?
We're good, Paul. Thanks.
Okay, great. Arlene, well, let's go back to the presentation. I think I just changed presenter back to you.
Mm-hmm.
You let me know if you got it back.
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Great. So, by the way, that was obviously a live demo for a true SaaS-based tool. There are multiple companies and users using it today, all of which are insulated from the other companies and/or users and vendors. So we started off with talking about, you know, what the benefit of using the Outsourcing Accelerator is, and I highlighted, you know, how if I did this on my own and I was new to it, it would take me 6 months and 500 plus hours. I think you could probably appreciate now that using the Outsourcing Accelerator, assuming I understand what I want to outsource, right? I've got to understand that. The tool's not going to do that work for me. But it gives me a facility to very quickly enter in all of those requirements because I'm picking from a cafeteria-style menu. And if my choice isn't there, then I can create it. I can invite vendors to bid in an online manner. The vendors can respond very quickly, assuming they've got all the pieces that they want to attach and include. They can ask their questions. I can answer their questions. I can keep track of all their questions electronically. And then I can produce a contract, you know, essentially by hitting a button, which is a first draft. So I've taken a process that could take 500 hours, and if everything was in a line, it could get done in a week. And I realize duration-wise it can't. But the tool does accelerate the process of, you know, getting a vendor selected and to a contract. Next slide, please. So, you know, what's the real cost savings here? You know, if you're a first-time developer of an RFP, you know, it's got to save you at least $45,000 just in time. If your time's only worth $100 an hour. If you're a seasoned developer, it can still accelerate the process and make it easier for the guy next to you to develop a similar RFP. So certainly there's cost savings there. From a time perspective, you know, what's it worth to get an RFP out quicker and complete the process quicker? And we've seen some of these processes take a year and a half, which is debilitating to the business. Typical RFP process can take up to a year for something of size. Right? So you have to decide what's it worth to get it out faster, to get the right vendor engaged quicker. On to quality and consistency. You know, what's it worth to you to manage a consistent and high quality vendor submission, vendor selection process with all the audit trails built in and everybody accessing the collaborative system. Again, that's something you have to decide. Next slide, please. Dan, would you like to take us home here?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So this was very exciting. I'm a little bit wowed myself. It's been a few weeks since I've seen the most recent iteration of this. So thank you, Paul. There's a couple more quick questions I think we have time for if you're up for it. The first one is around company size. Do you see, you do a lot of advisory work. Do you see any limitations on this tool for certain size organizations over others?
It's a good question, Dan. I would say 2 years ago, only large organizations took large deals out to RFP. That's changed considerably. So we're seeing RFPs for things as small as, a 7 or 8 person outsourcing deal, right? Somebody wants to outsource their 8-person accounts receivable department, right? Highly usable and a great application for the tool. We've also seen large organizations want to outsource 100 persons worth of testing services. Another very good application for the tool, especially if it's a competitive bid, right? You want to invite 6 vendors to bid on it, right? If you think about what it would take, yeah, you could produce an RFP, but then you've got to get 6 vendors' formal responses, and then you've got to assemble evaluators to evaluate 6 responses, and do all that via spreadsheet across, a limited number of evaluators, because every evaluator you add adds an algorithmic increase to the number of papers. So we've seen organizations really look at the evaluator module as being key to keep all the evaluations in one area in a consistent weighting and rating mechanism. We've also seen organizations take it in just for producing the contracts. They say, if I could get a starter contract that's got all the components of the RFP and the response embedded, and then I could go negotiate, that's worth everything to me. So we've seen very large organizations, we've seen mid-sized organizations, and we've seen small organizations. The one area that we have had a difficulty with is those who are running, a large-scale procurement package. The question asked earlier, right, about an MTORS or an SAP. And really, this tool sits next to those. This is a category killer. It's not meant to replace one of those other procurement tools. It's meant to sit next to it.
And how about from the vendor perspective, Paul? What's your impression been, or the vendor's impression on this tool to their kind of sales process, if you will?
Yeah. So vendors, their first inclination is to not like it because they feel it's limiting their ability to sell. Once they get into it and they understand that, what it's doing is it's saving you on pre-sales time. It's letting you get all your data in a consistent manner that allows the client to be informed, and you're still going to have the opportunity to actually sell and build a relationship with the client. The intent behind the tool isn't to keep the vendors at arm's length. It's actually to pull the right vendors in closer sooner. So once they realize that, then it makes good sense. Where we've really seen an uptick is when a vendor who's already used the tool gets the second RFP, because they've already got all of their information templated. So now they're just saying, see attachment, see attachment, see attachment, and they're attaching, here's my approach to risk management, here's my approach to project management, here's my approach to fixed fee pricing, here's a sample work plan. Right? So on the second iteration, they're responding much quicker. They can actually get through many more RFPs, as opposed to what it takes to build an RFP response from scratch.
Right. No, it seems like an efficiency. All right, Paul, one more question, which is the typical question on price and packaging. Can you give us any, at least a sense as to how this is being packaged? I know you mentioned software as a service type of model as an option.
Yeah, so the tool is, again, inception since 2009, rollout since 2010. The first rollouts have been with big organizations, and we've provided them with enterprise-wide licenses. And that was really our testing ground for the tool. So now we're at a slightly different stage in the tool's lifecycle where we're making it available to the general public, to where you can sign on and pay per episode, meaning for one RFP. And by the way, the fee for one RFP is sub $10,000, right? It's thousands of dollars, but sub 10 for an RFP usage. So you may have a big RFP that's going to run for 6 months, and you want to involve 7 buyers, 6 vendors who are going to bid on it, and 12 evaluators and 2 negotiators. You would pay an episodic fee for that. That ranges between $5,000 and $10,000. You may also be a lone gun user. You say, I'm a procurement person. I'm in a mid-sized shop. I've got a specific need to outsource, 10 bodies worth of application maintenance for a legacy mainframe COBOL app or a web-based Java app, whatever it is. And, I would really like access to this tool. You can join very soon through the Outsourcing Institute's website and pay literally a couple $100 a month as a subscription to gain access to the tool. So we've taken what's a world-class tool used by big companies and are making it now accessible to essentially everyone, depending how you want it used. So the question had come up earlier, what's the difference between this and one of the large procurement packages? Those packages are millions of dollars to implement. This package you could get up and running for a couple $100 a month or a few $1,000s for one episode. So very different targeted pricing.
Good stuff, Paul. Thank you so much. You did a great job of giving us an overview in under an hour here, so appreciate it. If anybody would like more information or would like a full walkthrough demo and even more detail than you saw here, please email or call Frank Cassell, who's leading this from the Outsourcing Institute side. Be happy to speak to you about your specific needs and how you might be able to utilize this tool. Paul, thanks again for your time today.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.